Honors this tradition of the volunteers and the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade by presenting an award to one of our contemporaries who continues the struggle for justice and democracy on our airwaves today. Among this crowd, among you people, Amy Goodman does not need a long-winded introduction. But to be truthful, one can never say thank you enough to a person like Amy who puts her body and soul on the line day after day and speaks truth to power and tells us the news. Telling the news these days, you know, isn't so easy. You go to St. Paul to cover the Republican National Convention, you might get arrested. You go to Canada to give a little speech, and you spend hours being interrogated by the Border Patrol, wondering and asking and demanding to know what you intend to talk about. Freedom of the airwaves isn't freedom of the airwaves quite the same way as it may have been. Not to mention the corporate influences that keep some of the most important news out of the news altogether. Not Amy. Last week she was giving us reports from Bolivia about community protests for drinking water and for workers' rights. Her program, Democracy Now!, has taken her to the corners of the earth and fortunately back to us in New York. Our mission, says Amy, is to make dissent commonplace in America. And Bill Moyers, who wrote the introduction for her new book, Breaking the Sound Barrier, says, as you will discover on every page of her new book, Amy knows the critical question for journalists is how close they are to the truth, not how close they are to power. Like I.F. Stone, she values the facts on the ground. She's won many important awards in the field of journalism, as well as the Puffin Nation Prize for Creative Citizenship. So it's a privilege to present Amy to you right now. Amy Goodman. It comes with a check and a scroll, and let me just read what it says, and I think I'll help carry it off. It's kind of weighty. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives does hereby honor Amy Goodman with the Alba Activist Award for her exemplary courage and perseverance as an investigative journalist and for her unflinching leadership in combating social and political injustice. This tribute acknowledges Amy Goodman's work, which embodies the spirit of activism of the volunteers of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Presented by the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives on the 2nd day of May 2010, in memory of those who risked their lives in defense of freedom during the Spanish Civil War. Amy Goodman.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here today. I only wish I was following Maddie actually to be able to hear him speak here today. Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives. The archives are so important, and to see these photos, how important they are to be able to see the images. Whether we're talking about more than a half a century ago or today, bringing them to life. We have a media in this country that whites out history. And we have to, in covering every issue, put it in context. Give the context of the movements, which is why I'm also so sorry as I hear the names of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade volunteers who we've lost over the years. I think someone who would consider himself an honorary one would have been Howard Zinn, and to have lost him as well. Who taught us about the movements of this country which made it great. Not the generals, not the wars, but the movements of people, of which Abraham Lincoln Brigade volunteers were so active over the years. You know, I originally come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded in 1949, just after World War II, in Berkeley, California. Lou Hill, conscientious objector in World War II, came out of the detention camps and said there has to be a media outlet not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists, and that's how this network was founded, now 5 stations strong, WBAI, of course, here in New York, 99.5 FM. In Houston, when the station went on the air in 1970, KPFT, was on for a few months, and then it was blown up by the Ku Klux Klan. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. And when they got back on their feet, they blew it up again. The silver lining being, you know, they hardly had money for advertising, obviously, and they certainly, the Klan blew it into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of Houston. I don't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops. I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is, because it allows people to speak for themselves. And whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother or an Afghan uncle or an aunt from Iraq or Cuba, you say, that sounds like my baby or my bubba. That sounds like someone I know. You don't have to agree, but it begins to break down barriers. It challenges stereotypes and caricatures that fuel the hate. How important it is to see the images. It's what we do every day on Democracy Now!, on television and on radio, is to bring out those voices and those images. You know, Peter mentioned the book, Breaking the Sound Barrier, and the first column in the book goes back to the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, to the United Nations, to the Security Council, and to a tapestry that has hung outside the Security Council for a quarter of a century, has become the most famous anti-war symbol, Guernica, by Pablo Picasso. You know, during the Franco years, Guernica, Spanish city, was bombed. And in a frenzy of painting, he was in Paris at the time, for 3 weeks he painted this painting. But he said he never wanted it to be brought to Spain during the Franco years. As long as Franco was in power, his painting should never be brought to Spain. And he had Parisian weavers make 3 tapestry reproductions of Guernica. And one of those reproductions, because he was afraid the painting going around the world would get destroyed, and one of those paintings, the tapestries, is in front of the UN Security Council and has been for a long time, until it's being renovated in the last few weeks. So it was moved to England and it's taking a world tour. But that image, that painting, that tapestry, was hanging in front of the UN Security Council right before the invasion. Remember when General Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, was giving his push for war at the UN on February 5th, 2003. And it wasn't lost on the UN and US representatives, the irony of having US and UN officials pushing for war in front of the backdrop of the Guernica. And so they shrouded it with a blue curtain. It's our job to pull those curtains back, to show to see the agony and the pain of war etched in the faces of the people and the animals. It's our job to pull the curtains back and show the reality of war. We're not there to airbrush it. We're there to talk about what's happening on the ground and how many anti-war protests we've gone to cover, and we've seen veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Clarence Kalin,